It is admittedly odd to consider 2012, just 10 years ago, as part of history, but technically, everything in the past is. Likewise, everything is also a primary source, including, or in this podcaster's opinion especially, movies. 2012's Django Unchained was the second of 3 Quentin Tarantino-directed movies to dabble in the Western genre, the first being Kill Bill Volume 2, and the third is The Hateful Eight. And as all movies do, this Western, a piece of historical fiction, tells us more about the time period from which it was produced than it does about history itself. Lara Cayouette assisted me in dissecting this picture and the Western film genre itself. She would know a thing or two about Django Unchained, as she starred in the movie as Lara Lee Candie-Fitzwilly, and her expertise in film and film history shines through from her career as an actor, director, producer, writer, and teacher. A brief word, though. Laura and I recorded this over the summer, and fittingly for a movie that takes place in the Deep South, it was quite humid that day, even here in New Hampshire. Therefore, the Wi-Fi was interrupted a few times as we chatted, producing some off sounds. I apologize in advance, but I hope that you enjoy the content just as much as I did recording it. Welcome back to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source. I'm Eric Paul, and you can find the show everywhere you get your podcasts. That's how you're listening to it right now, I'm sure, but also on Instagram. That's where I hang out the most. And if you like what we do here, go to patreon.com/EPS podcast, become a patron, support the show, and you might get a little goodies here and there every few months, depending on the tier that you sign up for. I am very, I'm overwhelmed by the fact that I was able to get this interview set up, because it seemed like every time that we offered a date, something didn't work out. But I'm glad to be joined today by Lara Cayouette, who is an actress, among other things, right? You've done a lot.
Yes, I've authored 8 books, and I'm a filmmaker. And I have a pretty long list of things I'm good at.
You've taught English classes before.
I've taught graduate level directors how to work with actors at UNO. University of New Orleans. Mm-hmm. I've taught at universities and film schools throughout the country, and even in the UK.
Oh, wow.
So yes.
And that's actually something we're going to touch on in a little while, when it comes to film schools and learning about the craft and the art of filmmaking, that sometimes filmmakers go through that and actually, and other times they're self-taught, right? There's kind of like,
same with actors, same with authors. Yeah. Same with musicians
and podcasters, as it turns out. So among the credits that people are most familiar with you, and what we're going to be focusing on today, would be the work that you did with Quentin Tarantino, including Kill Bill Volume 2, where you played Rocket, and in 2012, Django Unchained, in which you played the sister to Leonardo DiCaprio's character. And let's see how fast you can say the full name, because there's a lot to it, right?
Lara Lee Candie-Fitzwilly.
That's such a Mississippi name, right? It's such a
well, he actually based it on my name, which is Lara Lee Candie-Fitzwilly. So he had a little help there.
That's awesome. And so did you have input in that character, in the creation of it?
Actually, I'm really thrilled to say that he, when I worked with him on Kill Bill, he was still in the part of his career where I don't know how many of your listeners would know this, but when he started out, every comma, every ellipsis, everything that any actor ever uttered in Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, his earlier work, mm-hmm. It was all written out. Every was all written out in his scripts. By the time you get to Django, he's allowing us to own our parts a little more. He's hiring people he's already worked with, and he's sort of trusting us with our roles. So with me, he had written the part with me in mind, and he let me know. He said, I'm trusting you to fill this in. I don't know anything about a Southern Belle. You need to fill this in for me.
So is that, in the previous style of writing as an actor, are you bothered by that if they write out every single and ah, and is that like, you don't feel like you can handle it yourself, or do you get annoyed by that, or is it just whatever?
I think because I was theater trained, I don't have a reaction to it so much. I don't think making it your own, that idea of making a part your own, is about the language. The language is the writer's. The writer is in charge of the way that character talks. You're not. And so for me, in theater, you're not allowed to change one word or you could get sued. So I'm trained that way. I'm trained for theater and not changing one word. And so for me, it's not that big of an adjustment. Are there times that I've suggested to a director that, it'd be easier for me if this weren't a tongue twister, or, I separate these two words with another word so that I can get it all in, or, I've negotiated before to try and make something a little more easy for my mouth to handle. Right. But I don't feel like, I'm not, as much as I am a writer in my life, I don't feel the need to be a writer when I'm acting.
I see. So you're able to separate those things enough that, you come off as, just like, okay, I can. So I assume therefore film acting might be even that much more almost enjoyable because you have that much, more flexibility with the actual material. And that's actually the first question. So what we're going to be talking about today.
TV acting has the most flexibility, but yeah.
Yeah. And it's, so TV act, I was going to ask you about that because one of the other credits, the one that stands out a lot for me, and I mentioned this to you is your appearance on Friends. in that episode with the screamer. That's the one with the screamer. And my wife and I, we are quote factories. I think it's just how we were raised. We grew up, in the 80s and 90s, and we had, I used to have VHS tapes that I would record, reruns of Friends and Seinfeld and The Simpsons. And when I went to bed at night in college, I would just put a tape on and watch it. And so we have these like in our brains. And your line that you say to Ross of, well, I don't know. I just don't want to, see if
wait around for somebody who may or may not scream.
It's just so like, we use that every now and then when we're just, chatting, and that always like cracks me up because the way you just like deliver that. So like, well, I don't know. I mean, like giving the options, like, whether or not this guy's going to freak out. But I was thinking about that show, and I was thinking about what we're going to be talking about today. And that's a pair of Quentin Tarantino movies, as well as just the genre of Westerns. But I was thinking about that as, the 90s, and I mean, it was the age of Generation X. I mean, it was like, Generation X was really in its full, like, creative outlet era, was the 90s and the early 2000s. And I realized that Quentin Tarantino is, just a shade older than Gen X, but I mean, just like astrology, it's not like you can nail it down exactly.
This much over the line to boomer.
Right, exactly. Like he's just, and same thing with like myself. I was born in early 1981, so like technically I'm a millennial, but
it's not supposedly. Now somebody said this to me, and what do I know? But when you're on the cusp like that, rather than using the year to decide which generation you are, you use your lifestyle. What were you born into? And so, for example, Quentin and I are born on that line of, boomer, but both he and I were raised as latchkey kids.
Right.
And there are no boomer latchkey kids. That's not a thing.
It's not at all. And I think I know I was, at least for a certain part of my life, a latchkey kid. My brother and I would come home from school, and mom and dad were both at work. And so we would, have to have our snacks and, entertain ourselves and put ourselves to doing homework and stuff like that. And my brother is definitely a Gen Xer. He was born in that time. And, I always looked up to him, and I also looked up to people a little bit older than me. And so that I I like to, Gen X sounds a lot cooler than millennial anyway. So I put myself with that. And so when it comes to these movies, in all of his movies, but particularly these two that we're going to talk about as Westerns, the material. So when I analyze a primary source, for those of you listening, maybe for the first time, I treat things like movies the same way a museum curator would treat a porcelain bowl or some, an old clock or something like that. What's it made out of? How is it made? Was it handcrafted? Was it, mass produced? All the way down to, what ideas are conveyed through this thing existing. And so when it comes to a movie, particularly a pair of movies that are fitting into that Western genre, that's part of the material, but it's also, the maker's own life and lifespan. Where did you see Quentin Tarantino most present in both of those movies?
As a voice?
Yeah, I mean, as sort of like...
He's actually it is present in some of those movies. Right. I don't know if you know that, but he's actually an actor. He has two parts in Django, and people don't realize that. They always are like, oh, he can't act. He was terrible in that role, and da-da-da. And I'm like, well, did you like him in that other role? And they're like, oh, that was him? No, he was great. So people who like to hate on Quentin as an actor, if they don't know it's Quentin doing the acting, they accidentally like him. But I assume you mean as a voice, which one speaks from his...
Because like if somebody else had written and directed it, it would look totally different. It wouldn't be him.
It would. And first of all, I don't know of a whole lot of white people who should have meddled in the Django world. So that's one thing right away, is that, Quentin has told a story that is a Black story of heroism and love and all that, you can call that appropriation or whatever you want to do about that. But he has told a story that is outside of his own wheelhouse. If we just look at, who's Quentin and who's the lead of Django.
Yeah.
Same though with Kill Bill. Quentin is also not a woman, and he is also doesn't have access to Asian culture any more than those of us who travel do. I lived in Japan till I was 5, but I wouldn't think of myself as somebody who could appropriate Asian culture either, like in Kill Bill. So he's a very brave storyteller because he has decided that the planet is his playground and that he can tell stories about the planet. He doesn't have to stick to his own situation. That said, I am going to go ahead and reveal, it's probably on Wikipedia somewhere, I don't know, but he was raised by a single mother, and her choices, like all of us who are raised by a single parent, or any parent, our parents' choices affect us. And when he was young, she chose a neighborhood, a common law husband, a lifestyle, and all that were Black. And so I think Django is a fantasy for Quentin on a lot of levels, not just that it's this great story of a Black hero getting the girl, etc. But that it's Quentin's fantasy of coming out of being a trailer park kid raised by a teenage mom and badassing his way to freedom. So yeah, I think in some way, I mean, the story that's really the most Quentin is probably True Romance, but that's another podcast.
Right. And I think about it, and I feel like when he worked at Video Archives, that, I mean, in itself is like the most Gen X job, working at a video store. Video stores don't even exist anymore, and they didn't exist 10 years before, he worked in one. And it's almost like his films, he's going right down the shelf of, the different sections of the store. Here's the, because with Reservoir Dogs, it's a gangster movie, and Pulp Fiction is gangstery, but it's also, a Pulp Fiction story. And, all the way through with Kill Bill Volume 1, I liked how you said that it's an Eastern movie.
Although I
and
think
then
Reservoir Dogs, he was trying to go at foreign film.
okay, so trying to do more of like an Italian, type or French, kind of film, like a heist movie kind of thing.
I think he was trying to speak to Godard and other filmmakers of other countries that were avant and independent and were putting forward a voice that was uniquely their own.
Yeah. And I mean, so that's like, it's something that's so unique to that era of the 70s and the 80s when, you're, growing up. And like, I was just talking to some people. I did a live podcast yesterday where I was at a museum and people were coming in, and I had a table full of just artifacts, and different things. And they talked to me about, and two different people selected the Grease soundtrack. I had the record of that, and they both, came from different walks of life. They were, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, but they both shared in the same thing. They both said, I must have seen this in the theater 10 times when it came out. Like they were, alive in the 70s when it came out, and I must have seen it 15 times. And they loved the record because, in those days, once it was out of the theater, you couldn't go back and see it again. You have to wait for it to come back out.
Right.
The soundtrack goes in the exact same, format of the movies. The songs are in order from when they came out. So it's a replacement for that, yes. So you're just like, as you're going about your business, you can listen to your movie, basically the highlights of it. And
that's what made movies like American Graffiti so huge.
Yeah. That album is perfect.
Yeah.
And that's, by the way, that's my all-time favorite movie is American Graffiti.
Well, it's a very good choice.
Yeah. It's another one of the, and so like with
definitely
that one,
in my top.
George Lucas, that's a nostalgia film. And it seems like in a lot of ways, you move ahead 20 years, and when Quentin Tarantino starts making his movies, those are also nostalgia films, nostalgic for, there's definitely a 70s motif in a lot of them. They look very 70s, even if they're set in present day, in the 90s or early 2000s. And
Westerns are inherently nostalgic.
Yeah.
Westerns are inherently looking back on a simpler time.
Right. And that was actually my next part of this I was going to ask you about is, and particularly from a writer's standpoint and somebody who's involved in the movie industry, what does it say to you about the time period in which a movie's made when they select, so Django Unchained takes place in 1858, right? Yeah. And of course it has to take place in 1858 because slavery still exists in the movie. Right. It can't be post 1865. I think most Westerns that people think about, are usually just kind of like, 1880s, like, just kind of anytime after Civil War when the West was really, growing fast and it was the Wild West and all that. So what does it say to you about 2012 and, 2010, 2011, that, first decade or so of the 21st century, that a filmmaker says, I want to tell a story about the middle of the last of 2 centuries ago, 19th century. I mean, there's history goes back and back and back. Why that time and place? Why do you think he chose it?
First of all, I do think that the idea of a warrior slave, a slave who rebels and, breaks out of his chains, is an idea that I've heard of my whole life. I remember even as a kid when we were studying slavery, I remember, hands going up saying, why didn't they just rebel? Yeah. Why didn't they just kill their owners? So I think that's a question that you could do a million stories about, because of course there were slaves who rebelled. Mm-hmm. There's a very famous story here in New Orleans about a rebellion that ended very badly, but could have changed everything. You could do an alternative history story movie about what would have happened if that slave rebellion had won out, because they were literally on the edge of New Orleans when they were shut down. I'm saying that delicately, when they were murdered and their heads were put on stakes to make sure that nobody else would ever try again. But yeah, that idea of why don't they rebel? Why don't they fight back? I think that's something that a lot of people wonder about. But I see Django as sort of a coming of age story of a man who, normally a coming of age is a child growing to adulthood. And in this one, it's a grown man who's called boy, who becomes a grown man who's his own man. And so in that way, it's a coming of age of somebody redesigning themselves.
Right.
And that is very of our time. The idea that if you are just strong enough and work hard enough, and that's also uniquely American, that if you, just put yourself to the task, that you can free yourself from your present life and pursue some unchained life. And so I think that is part of it, is this fantasy of, because I think the reason that we all ask, why didn't they rebel? Why didn't they fight back? Is because we like to think that we would, but then if you look at our lives, we mostly don't.
Right. And the West offers such a perfect setting for that too. A lot of us in the eastern parts of the country feel very hemmed in by even just the infrastructure or whereas the West is wide open, the opportunities just present themselves.
Now, to be clear, because I don't want to get too technical about it because I don't think it in the end matters, but to be clear, Quinn has an odd habit of setting his Westerns not in the West.
Well, that's what's funny because that takes place Django's in Texas, but also it comes back east to Mississippi. Yeah. And that brings up a good question though, is does a Western actually have to be in the West, or does it even have to be, because it just be in Western civilization?
And the answer is, if you're Quentin and you are familiar with the history of the Western, then you know that the late 60s, early 70s were characterized by spaghetti Western.
Yeah.
None of which took place in the West because they all took place in Italy.
Right.
So
wait,
I think
did it. Oh, go ahead.
I think he's just taking off of that it doesn't that it's a genre. It's not a place. It's a genre.
And there's certain kinds of characters that show up there. They usually have, the lawman and the wildness and the.
The Seven Samurai is a Western, and Western is an idea.
Right. I did for my first season of the podcast, and I did an episode on Rogers Rangers. Northwest Passage, the Spencer Tracy movie from 1940. And that's categorized as a Western as well, even though it takes place in New England and Quebec, very not Western at all. But because the adversaries are Native Americans and because, the Rangers they're Rangers. I mean, that's what the law enforcement in Texas is called, so they're the predecessors to all that. It does get that title of Western, even, because there's shoot 'em up scenes and all that.
Well, there's motifs that appear. There's usually a picture. There's all sorts of motifs that appear in any genre.
And you have to survive on your own wits, and you can't rely on the law to help you, or the government or anything like that. It's interesting because in 2012, that's the same year that Steven Spielberg came out with Lincoln. Another, in this case, a sweeping historical epic, so both of them deal though with the same, because, Lincoln, of course, isn't a whole, just, the life of Lincoln. It's specific to the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, to outlaw slavery. And it takes that, I think that time period, and I say it like it's 100 years ago, it's 10 years ago, but that time period was a lot of reflection for the country, for our society, of looking at race, looking at achievements, I mean, that was
we had a black president.
Right.
So
he was reelected that year. That was the year of his reelection.
I know I'll get in trouble for this, but I actually thought of Django as the antidote for Lincoln. I thought Lincoln, I'm sure it's a very finely crafted movie and all that, but I just felt like it was yet another of the million of white men talking about whether all the rest of us are allowed to have rights. And I just was like, why do I need to see the movie?
No, that you bring up a good point because, and I think a lot of times, even the genre of the Western acts like that as a counterbalance to the movies, because you can't get any more Eastern than Lincoln. He's in Washington. You go any further eastern in the Atlantic Ocean,
right,
or Chesapeake Bay, but then the ocean after that.
Well, Easterns are usually the Hong Kong movies, but yes, I get your point.
You know what I mean? So it's like, as far for our geography, it's not the West. It's not the
no.
So
but Westerns are about self-determination. Westerns are about that American thing of going into the unknown and making your own path. That's what Westerns are usually about, is that uniquely that American thing of I'm going to go into the unknown and claim my own space and do it my own way.
So like the directors of the Westerns from, the golden age of Hollywood, or at least the 50s and 60s, which I realize tail end of golden age into the age of having to compete with TV. Comparing with those, like John Ford was, a big Western director, and John Wayne being a big star. And I think he directed The Alamo. What was, by the time that Quentin Tarantino had made Kill Bill and then Django, what was his status in society by that point? Do you think his name preceded him?
Well, I will tell you exactly, because having been right there for both moments, I can tell you that in Kill Bill, Quentin was already quite the filmmaker and was already globally a phenom, but he was still making his movies his way. They were all versions of how he did Pulp Fiction, insofar as he would gather together a large cast of interesting actors, but generally speaking, not box office stars. Generally speaking, they were what he called shiny pennies, actors who we had sort of forgotten about, or who we had never honored properly, or who he felt like their careers had ended too soon, or they hadn't been, appreciated in their time or whatever. So he was peopling his movies with like Michael Parks and David Carradine and all these people who, maybe we had forgotten to love. And by the time you get to Django, the first poster for Django only has one name on it.
Right.
And it's Quentin's. And so Django is chock-a-block with A-list Academy Award winner, big box office draw stars. And yet the only name on the poster was Quentin's.
Right. And I think that says a lot, because talk about a time period that celebrates in his own way. He's like the self-made man, he's a self-made filmmaker.
He's the poster child for the American dream.
Yeah.
He has 8th grade education, and he is the Shakespeare of our time.
Right. And I know that, I don't know if you can see behind me, I have my Reservoir Dogs t-shirt behind me.
Well, I could have been bigger, but I'm looking at the thing. So
and I have that shirt, and for longest time,
I'm going to make you jealous. I have a Video Archives t-shirt.
Oh, because didn't he move Video Archives into his home? Isn't that?
He did, but that's not where I got it. I got it from his best friend. His best friend had a couple left. He had 2 left, I think. And he was like, I'm going to let you have 1.
That's so neat. That is much better. But I also had a Pulp Fiction shirt, and, I was in the 90s and I was in high school, and then, but 99, I went to college. So those were that was the way that you would signal to other people what you were into. Right. And how cool you were. And I watch Quentin Tarantino movies and I understand them,
Right.
That was, and just same way with, the early 90s was the video store clerk turned movie maker. I think of Kevin Smith with Clerks, where actual movie rental place is part of that, the setting. And that era is behind us, but it was very much alive and respected in the 90s into the early 2000s, that we know this guy's he's going to pour all of his effort into making this the best movie. He's not just going to churn out movies. And if it appears that it's churned out, that's on purpose, right? He's trying to.
Right. And he said that to me one time. I was giving him notes on Kill Bill. And I said something about, did you realize this was a cliche? And he said, no, thank you for pointing that out. I'm more than happy to use a cliche, but I want to know I'm using it. I don't want to accidentally be cliche. Yeah. So he wants everything to be purposeful, even if he's bending or breaking rules. He wants to be on chart. He wants to be the one in charge of what's happening.
Like, I think about the opening sequence for Jackie Brown. It just goes on and on, right? It's very long, and you're just like watching her, like, and
on the people, yeah.
And you're just like, okay, but I know this isn't like he made a mistake, or it's like, no, this is very much detail driven. Like, it's clear that he knows what he's doing, because especially as we've all been into those video stores. Well, not everybody nowadays, but those of us who lived through the age of video stores, how often did you go in there and the clerk has whatever they're wanting to watch up on the screen, and they're taking it in, right? And they're the ones who can give you the real insight onto what you should be watching. And because
look, I'm going to tell you, one of the reasons that Quentin and I bonded over 20 years ago is because I worked at a movie theater tearing tickets for 8 years, and I only worked one day a week, but I stayed there for 8 years, long enough that I actually tore tickets for 3 of my own movies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because I love movies so much. And it was a way of me being surrounded by other movie lovers and having the movie going experience for free, you know?
That must have been really cool to be able to, welcome people into your own movie. You're like, I'll take that ticket.
You know what's funny is people don't know, they don't notice who tears their tickets. The first one was Enemy of the State, and I'm in my underwear. And so I was a little concerned because I was like, I'm right here accessible, and they're going to go watch me in my underwear. And what I realized very quickly was, other than the regulars who knew me, nobody notices who's tearing their tickets. Right. So 10 minutes later, if they see me in my underwear, they're not going to know that was me.
So was that in Los Angeles that you worked that job?
Yeah. Okay.
Because I was going to say, pretty much the rest of the country, it can be assumed that the person taking your ticket had nothing to do with the movie you're about to see.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and in LA as well, you can mostly get away with assuming that. Yeah. You couldn't at our theater, because the theater I worked, I tore tickets, and then the guy that would sweep up your popcorn was Aaron Paul.
Oh, wow. That's so cool. Speaking of another Western that's not, with Breaking Bad.
Yeah. So he was a teenager who worked as an usher at the same theater.
I'm hoping next year my family and I, we want to take a trip to California. I've never been. My wife has, but I've never been to any part of California, let alone Los Angeles. And I'm so interested in going, just because it's such a different culture. It's such a showbiz culture there that, even in Boston, it's not like that, where people are trying to.
Well, most of
not
what
to the
you'll
same
be
extent
able to see is behind a velvet rope.
Right.
You can't really participate in the movie culture because it's so.
What I mean is, like, people working, like the guy making your coffee might also be trying out for auditioning.
The Western film genre has its origins going as far back as the motion picture industry itself, and the indicators of whether or not a story is a Western seems to be more thematic than geographic. Additionally, while most movie viewers usually consider Westerns to take place in the post-Civil War era, there are no time constraints either. For instance, John Ford's Jumps Along the Mohawk takes place in colonial upstate New York, and while his movie version of The Grapes of Wrath takes place in the traditional West, it is set in the present day, or for Ford that is, Great Depression era United States. Therefore, Django Unchained has far more Western elements than others in the same classification, simply by taking place in the 19th century and involving some locales west of the Mississippi River. and its function in American cinema in 2012 is consistent with how so many other westerns, both romanticized and revisionist alike, behaved in their respective time periods.
But so we left off talking about the location, the LA area, and how you can bump into really anybody that is involved in the movie making. And
I'm going to tell you a funny story about that I just remembered, which is back in the 90s, I was with Richard Dreyfuss, and he has 3 children, and they were all pretty small back then. And one of the children said something about why did they live in LA? Mm-hmm. And Richard said, well, all movie stars live here. This is, where we work.
Right.
And he was like, what do you mean? And Richard was trying to get him to understand what it was. And I finally said, here's the story. If you go to, say, Wichita, and you're standing in line at the bank at Wichita, the guy in front of you is not going to be Michael J. Fox.
Right.
And he was like, okay. And I said, and the person behind you at the Rite Aid is not going to be Tom Cruise. And he was like, okay. And I said, that's how it is that none of those people will be at the gas station, at your school. You'll never see any of those TV and movie people ever at anywhere that you're going, at the doctor's office, the waiting room, nothing, the DMV. You'll never run into any of them. And he was like, really?
So for a kid growing up there, he's like, that's like the opposite of what most people, like if we kind of picture that, it's like, that must be so cool to run into these people everywhere. And
I lived there for 18 years, and I used to make my friends play a game with me called Wish Upon a Star, that when they would arrive for their visit, I would say, wish upon a star, say which star you want to meet, and we'll just put that out there. And by the end of your trip, you will have met them. And it almost always worked. Wow.
Who is like the longest shot, would you say, like the long shot?
So we're on the way. It's me and my 2 best friends from high school. So it's me, it's a carload of Marylanders. And although none of us are really actually Marylanders, but in any case, we're all heading to a party at a friend of mine's house in Malibu. And on the way there, Angela had been living in Italy for 17 years, and it was her first year back in America. And I said, who do you want to meet at the party? And she said, well, I've been in Italy for years. I don't even know any movie stars anymore. I get all the movies dubbed. I don't know what any of them sound like. I don't really pay attention to movies anymore. I'm just not into it. And I said, okay, but there's somebody. And she goes, well, if I were going to meet anybody, the only person I really would have any interest in meeting would be Jack Nicholson. And I said, okay. Well, I had never seen Jack at this friend's house, but I had met Jack at other places. So I thought, well, he's probably not going to be at this party, but I could maybe figure out where he is and go find him for her at some point. So we walk into the party, and we're early. So there's only like maybe a dozen people there already. And we're early because I'm friends with the host, and I wanted to introduce him to my friends from high school and all this stuff. So we arrive, there's maybe, like I said, a dozen people there. And as I walk in, I see Warren Beatty, and I'm like, oh, hey. And I go and start talking to him. And just as I'm introducing my friends, there is Jack. It's like, oh. So I introduced him to my friends, and they sat for a couple of hours visiting.
Wow.
And at the end of the evening, the party gets huge. All these people show up. It gets giant. And, it becomes this big moment, an event, and all these people are there, and crazy stuff is happening and whatever. And then at the end of the night, we're all, deciding whether to go to an after party. There's something at the Playboy Mansion. Does anybody want to go? All these things. Everybody's loading into cars and limos, trying to figure out what's next. Jack goes to get in his limo, and there are like 5 women in the back of the limo already waiting for him.
Oh, geez.
And yeah,
I know what that's like.
Waiting. Yeah, sure. Like you do, Yeah. And we're waiting for my car, and as he's getting into the limo, one of the girls says something to him and he goes, yeah, but did you go to high school with them?
That's great.
Because he thought it was so cool that we all knew each other since high school. Because, in LA, you don't have a lot of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, and in some ways, it's kind of like DC. I remember people saying that DC stands for displaced citizens. It's not like nobody's a local in DC.
Well, that's what I meant by none of us were really Maryland.
Right. Yeah, they're all
our parents' jobs, and we were all from all over everywhere.
Right. And so, but that story you just told sounds like it'd be a fantastic movie, to be honest with you. Or at least a fun, short film or something like that.
One scene in a movie, but
meeting Jack at the So going back to the Western genre, and my understanding, I could be wrong about this, but my understanding about LA, which you can't get any more Western than Los Angeles without being in the Pacific Ocean, is that one of the reasons why it became so rapidly the entertainment capital of the country was because of how far it was from DC, that all of the copyrights that were held for, whether it be innovations like different kinds of cameras or the stories that they were telling in the early days of Hollywood, that enforcement of those kinds of, infringement on those stories, it was the Wild West. Like, you could get away with doing a lot of stuff without paying the rights for stories, at least in the early days. Not to mention, of course, the weather's perfect for making movies outside, so it kind of helped with that too. But that's why it wasn't anywhere else that LA became that spot. So when making Django, was that filmed on location in Mississippi, or did you? Where was that one made?
Django was the first time that a studio was involved with the money. Mm-hmm. It's Quentin's first studio movie as opposed to an independent feature. So the budget was enormous. I really big. And so anything he wanted, he could have, which is really great for a filmmaker, as long as you're not somebody who's sloppy about money. And Quentin's definitely not sloppy about money. So the movie started in California and Montana, and they shot in those locations for about 5 months.
Wow.
All the snowy stuff, all that's done. Well, not all the snowy stuff. There's one scene where it's snowing and it's actually here in New Orleans. But
never happens.
Yeah, most of the snowy stuff and the wildernessy stuff and the Western stuff and all is California and Montana. Mm-hmm. And then after about 5 months of shooting, they came here to New Orleans and shot all the Candyland and Mississippi, like the Clio Club, all that stuff was shot here, and Plantation Alley.
Okay, so would you say, and you mentioned before that, none of Quentin's, and I can't call him first name, none of Quentin Tarantino's Westerns are actually in the West, the same way that you would expect them to be.
Well, now Kill Bill is in LA.
Yeah. So and that's what, I mean, I know geographically it is the furthest West. But California was like the East projected out West, like the origins of that, state coming into existence. And it seemed like that, the post-Civil War, the rest of the country from, the Missouri River out to California was just kind of like that was the wild land for the longest time.
Well, I can tell you that when we were discussing it, because there were actually, I'll give you a little insight that I've never really, I think, gotten to share. There were 3 of us that were working on these projects all at one time that were all sort of versions of Westerns. Mm-hmm. And so Quentin had already written Kill Bill, but he hadn't shot any of it yet. And he was working on polishing it and getting it ready. And I wrote a Western called Lone Star Trixie. And then Larry Bishop, who's the son of Joey Bishop, mm-hmm. wrote Hell Ride, which was a biker movie. And so the 3 of us were having these conversations about Westerns. And it was because 9/11 happened mm-hmm. that those conversations evolved. And it became much more about what it means to be an American.
Right.
And the thing that separates the American spirit from other places and in our country and in other countries. And the idea of, you know, why is this country valuable? What is it about our way of thinking and our way of doing things that is worth fighting for?
Yeah.
And so 9/11 played a part in, even though Quentin had already written Kill Bill, played a part in how, in the language, you know, in the filmmaker's voice of it. Because I think all of us were going through a period where we were feeling we were exploring what it meant for each of us individually, what it meant to be an American.
And I think that with that original era of Western genre of the 50s, that was inspired a lot of ways by the Cold War too. It was like telling uniquely American stories. I know the Walt Disney Company, Walt Disney himself, went out of his way to dive into American history for his live action movies that he put out. And then, you know, I mentioned before about the Alamo, you know, the original one, which I think was 1960, with John Wayne, was very much a Red Scare, you know, story of America being invaded by communism and keeping it separate. And then they remake, I don't know if it's really a remake of that movie, but just another Alamo story came out shortly after 9/11, early 2000s. And you get a different tone of, and like you said, what it means to be an American and what makes us unique and separated. I mean, you could read into that, into the more recent Alamo about immigration from Mexico, because the Mexicans are the antagonists in that as well. But I saw it more as a post 9/11 story, just the same way as these others.
The other thing I think that we were wrestling with was that the Old West and the New West were similar. This is one thing I did in Lone Star Trixie, was to like highlight that the Old West and the New West are married to each other through the idea that it's where you go to seek your fortune. It's where you go to hunt for gold. And so the wildness is coming from that, of people fortune seeking and being sort of singular in their vision instead of communal. It's not a community. The West is not a community. It's a bunch of people.
There's a great perspective that there's a historian by the name of Richard White who says that the West is actually a lot more urban than people think it is. You picture the West of being just wide open spaces, and there is that, of course, but the vast majority of the population actually lives in cities, and not, in there's really not much suburbs. Last summer, my family and I, we drove from New Hampshire to the Grand Canyon and back again, of course. And I'm not stuck there. And I noticed it right away, because the West in our country has had different meanings almost from the beginning, even before we were a country. Ohio was the West, and then it became the Northwest Territories area, Michigan, and then it became, and then all of a sudden California was, and then that in-between spot. But as you go further and further west, you get that distinct, like you just said, that like you are really out on your own out here. You need to survive by your own devices. You have to be able to be, you can't just, I was relating it to somebody. We were in Albuquerque, and I was talking to a woman there who had never been east. And I said how weird it is for us to, like, once you leave Albuquerque and head west, it's like 65 miles before the next anything shows up. If you were in New England and you drove 65 miles in any direction, you're going to go through populated areas, some more than others, but you're going to go through this town. You're going to see that farm. You're going to see that little village over here. And it's all very much, tied together. And it's such a different world. And so, I can see why movie makers are attracted to that if they're trying to tell a story that's important to a time period, like post 9/11, and then like the the early 2000s were a blur, honestly. Like it was a whole decade of trying to like figure out who we were and what was going on. And by the time we got it all down pat, we're like, oh, it's already 2011. Like we're out of that decade, and now we're on, heading even further into the 21st century.
Well, and like I said, Kill Bill, the definition of what it is to be an American then is extremely international. Kill Bill is an extremely international movie with a very broad cast. And it's that shiny pennies casting where you're right. We don't know who we are. We don't know what we like. So let's just try a little of everything and see what sticks. And by the time you get to 2012, we're back to like slicker packaging, like it was in the 80s. And it's sort of like coming off of the 70s, because the 70s, the late 60s, early 70s, the Westerns that define that era were things like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where it's independent filmmakers doing stories of anti-heroes instead of heroes.
Right.
And and it's very fresh and outside of the studio box. In the 50s, as you were saying, there was all that sort of John Ford, John Wayne type versions of Westerns that were very like men are men, women are women, and Native Americans are evil, and or they'll feed us corn, or like it was all very like, don't think about it too much. And the showdowns were like high noon type stuff, where it's like the good guy in the white hat versus the bad guy in the black hat. And then by the late 60s, early 70s, the avant filmmakers have just shredded that.
Right.
And you have Clint Eastwood playing a bad guy who's the good guy, because it's the good, the bad, and the ugly, and he's the good, So
I remember in the early 90s when The Unforgiven came out, and what a big deal that was. People were going, on saying like, wow, the Western is never going to be the same again. They brought
although he doesn't end up defining. You have the 80s, you have Silverado.
Yeah.
And Kevin Costner is one of the shiny, happy people in that very, very Hollywoody, very shiny, happy people version of a Western. I mean, Silverado is about as slick a Western as you're ever going to get without it being like a mockumentary.
Right.
Like without it being a joke, that's about as silly as you're going to get. It's not Blazing Saddles, because that's meant to be funny, but I'm saying, without intending to be a commentary on itself, Silverado is very 80s, extremely consciously 80s. And so it's interesting to me that the person who actually can speak to Westerns the most well at this date would be Kevin Costner, who did Dances with Wolves, but that brought, you have no idea how many people told him that you can't make a dime on a Western. And then now, ever since then, they've been trying to, make money off Westerns because he could be done. And now he's got Yellowstone, which is, raking in numbers, audience numbers like the Super Bowl.
Yeah. And going back to what we were saying before, even like Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul are Westerns as well. And even The Mandalorian, The Mandalorian is a Western in its style. And it's like, so we're, as a society, we seem to always be ready to go back into it, but with certain rules. Like you don't want to make it too cheesy or too, we don't want to go back to the Lone Ranger. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I'm pretty sure that Lone Ranger movie they made a couple years ago was a dud. It didn't do very well.
Well, now it stars a cannibal or something, so let's just not.
It wasn't what they were hoping for, I think.
No, it stars a cannibal and a white guy playing a Native American. So
that's going to be, an easy one to figure out why it didn't do great.
Which, by the way, I do want to address the whole white savior thing, because I know with Django there is a white savior character, and I think, that I think is part of Quentin. You had asked earlier, where is Quentin I think that's part of the role of Quentin in that movie, is he I think Quentin understood that at that time there were very few Black filmmakers who could tell that story, and he was a filmmaker who had
that's
to tell whatever story he wanted to tell.
Right. And that actually leads to the next question very nicely, because who is the intended audience or user of this? And now when I mentioned, I don't know if I hit record yet, but I mentioned about going to see Kill Bill and how, we went and I saw Jackie Brown before that. And the reason I went was because it was Quentin Tarantino. And I was like, and that was the measuring stick, if you will, of saying like, how cool are you of a moviegoer that you're going to go see this movie when it came out. And then, like I said before, when I was watching Kill Bill, that's when the film got messed up and we ended up, not realizing what was going on. By the time you get to 2012 with Django, is it still the same audience, or because it was such a big budget movie by comparison to the other ones, was it trying to appeal to a wider audience, people that had never seen a Quentin Tarantino movie before, or was it still? I
know that Sony wanted that. I know that Sony, is a studio, and so Sony wants to reach every man, woman, and child, and some of the unborn. I mean, they want to get everybody.
Yeah.
But they didn't make the movie. Quentin did, and so who Quentin's trying to reach, his audience hasn't evolved so much as aged. It's not that we, all of us who were there on day one are still there. We have never left Quentin. We have grown with him. We have gotten older with him. We have, now he has kids, maybe later than most of his audience did, but now he has kids with them, he is a moviegoer. And so he is writing for other moviegoers and directing for other moviegoers. I know that he always wants the moviegoer to have the most amazing experience. And that is his number one goal. And to him, a moviegoer is anybody who loves movies.
Right.
He doesn't think that there's such a thing as being too young, although he does think that there are some children who are underexposed who might react poorly to violence or to cussing or whatever. But he's like, there's plenty of kids out there who live in a world where cussing and violence is normal. So the movie hits them differently. He doesn't, he loves the fact that my mom's one of his biggest fans. He loves that, she's turned 82 today. It's her birthday today.
Oh,
and
happy birthday.
He loves that she's a huge fan. And I think that he especially appreciates having an international, multicultural, multi-generational, multi-gendered, multi-everything audience, because he's an American and he's a melting pot guy. He's part Italian, part Native American, part Irish.
From Tennessee, lived in California.
Yeah, from Tennessee. And
Right.
And so, I think he wants to speak to anybody who cares to listen.
Yeah. Oh, it shows. I mean, it's and that's why I think it's one of those things about, when you go see one of his movies, you're kind of like, you feel like you're part of a cool club in a way. It's like, when you're watching the movie, he sees you sitting there in the audience, and wants to, kind of give his salute to you, be like, I'm glad you came to see my movie, and here's some fun stuff, and, to make it worth your while. And I remember watching, when Pulp Fiction came out, I was still fairly young, to the point that my parents always, like, they didn't pre-screen it all the way, but like, if they got the feeling something was coming up, that they would watch it, they'd send me out of the room, and then like they would watch it, and then if it was okay, they'd bring me back in. But I remember my dad just howling with laughter in the opening sequence of that movie, with the conversation between Jules and Sam Jackson and John Travolta. And it was just like, I'm like, okay, that's my signal that this is, because my dad, he was like what, Quentin Tarantino had, as far as just like this being just surrounded with movies all the time. That is my dad still, that like there were so many times that he would sit me down to watch a movie and I'd be like, oh, this is old. It's I don't, and then 20 minutes into it, I'm like, this is grand. This is the best. and that I would fit, American Graffiti was one of those movies. I'm like, he was like, you'll like this. This is the guy who made Star Wars. And, not even a minute into that, I was hooked when I saw, the guy drive his scooter into the wall at the diner, at the drive-in. I was like, oh, this is awesome. Like, this is so funny already.
Richard Dreyfuss is a friend of mine for 30 years now.
And he's fantastic. I remember seeing, I'm like, that's Richard Dreyfuss. That's, Mr. Holland. And, it was like, that's the guy from Jaws. And so it's like
so good in American Graffiti though, because it's an ensemble cast, but it revolves around his story.
Yeah, he's the main character. If there is one, it's his.
If there is one, it's him.
Yeah, because he's the one that we see, leaving at the end after debating it all night long.
In the middle, there's the kids that have no intention of leaving, and the kids who have every intention of leaving, and he's the one in the middle going, "Which one am I?"
Right. He's Luke Skywalker, and that's. And another Western. I mean, it takes place in Southern California, so or Northern California, I guess, being George Lucas. But man, this has been so much fun. But I think we've hit pretty much all the other questions in some way or another. The ideas and behavior that it conveys, the prescript. Now, so just to be sure, the entire story of Django was created, right? There wasn't, it's not based on any like historical evidence.
There might be stories in there that are true, and I wouldn't necessarily know. For example, there's a lot of stuff that's been cut.
Yeah.
And I originally had a love story. I actually had two love interests in the movie. Mm-hmm. I had Christoph Waltz as a love interest, but I also had a character who was cut and then recast as Walton Goggins' character. And so me and Walton Goggins' characters were Billy Crash. We were supposed to have like a relationship of when there's nobody around. That's who I play house with.
Oh, I see.
And because my brother spends a lot of time on the road and yada yada. So my brother was to bring me home dates, and when he's not busy bringing me home dates like Christoph, I have this guy around the house that I play house with. And now I forgot what your original question was.
Well, just how historically accurate it is. It doesn't have any like real stories.
I had a story in my own family history. There is a true story that I had told Quentin about long ago. And so when this was happening, I said, I'm planning on using some of that as filler. And he said, well, I'm writing it in. And so he was writing in parts of my family history into that love story. And it all got cut. So since I know that happened, I do know that there's a possibility that there were other true things in the movie, but he's not a historian and he's not a historical filmmaker, and he has no interest in doing that. One of the things that is notable about both movies or any Quentin movie is the soundtrack. And both Kill Bill and Django, the person who did the music supervision was RZA from Wu-Tang.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you want to talk about somebody who, obviously RZA, but the entire Wu-Tang Clan, that's obviously at least 20 years of influence on our culture.
Right.
And it's captured in both of those movies that voice would be the voice to determine what would be the songs, that are right for Kill Bill and right for Django. And I think in Django, you see him nodding to that world of rap culture and rap thinking, hip hop thinking. When you see Django have the moment where he's allowed to wear anything he wants to go meet Big Daddy, and he chooses this blue suit with the big bows, of course we all laugh. It's entertaining, but beyond being entertaining, it sort of harkens to where we are now of that men peacock to show their power. And they often do that in the hip hop community through wardrobe, through choosing very look at me type of clothes that are very peacocky kinds of choices that are like, I am a man, but I want you to notice my appearance.
And so like, that's such a perfect thing to put this as, because it's like, if the movie was made 20 years earlier, right? Or even 30, it's like it would have come out totally different, even though it's the year it represents, the time period that it's meant to be in stays the same. The interpretation or what you do with it is informed more by the current times. Yeah.
Because it's set against the backdrop of us living in an era where our royalty at that time is like Beyonce and Jay-Z and Kim Ye and all that, you know. So the idea that what you would aspire to be, if you could be anything, if you could dress any way at all, would be, you know, to peacock as a man. I think that was something that is right for the era in which it was made.
That is so well put and such a good way to put this all together. I thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. This has been so much fun talking to you. Like I said at the beginning, somebody that all the movies you've been in, I've seen. And, you know, it's kind of cool being like, oh yeah, that I remember I saw it in the theater too. I mean, Enemy of the State, I remember seeing that in the theater, and I didn't know that you were giving, you know, tearing the tickets for the same movie, but that would have been fun. But thank you. And then your role in Friends will continue to be at the height for my household. I can be sure about that. I love that. But thank you so much, Laura, for joining the EPS podcast, where everything, including, well, all Westerns, but in this case, Kill Bill Volume 2 and Django Unchained, is a primary source. And we'll talk to you next time.
This is Season 2 of the EPS podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to what you've heard so far. Full-length episodes like this one are being delivered on Thursdays, while shorter episodes, the products of my EPS podcast live exhibits, come out on Tuesdays. If you like what you hear, consider becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/EPS podcast. Follow the show on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. I look forward to you tuning in again to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.